Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing a high-speed synthesis, really dedicated entirely to understanding the modern architecture of digital risk. We're pulling together dense research from national security, corporate risk management, and global regulation to build, well, a unified playbook for cyber resilience. Our mission is to give you that critical, synthesized knowledge you need, going from the highest government strategy, right down to the internal practices that can save organizations millions. We're connecting geopolitics directly to your corporate risk portfolio.
And what's really fascinating here is the strategic pivot we're seeing. I mean, we're fundamentally shifting away from just focusing purely on prevention, this idea you can just build a perfect wall. Resilience now, it means building dynamic capabilities, capabilities that anticipate and crucially adapt to constant volatility. We'll explore why concepts like, say, flexibility and organizational culture are now really essential defense mechanisms, and also why neglecting governance around new internal tools like AI can actually add over $500,000 to a single data breach cost.
Okay, Red, let's unpack this then, starting with the biggest possible picture. These blueprints nations are using to protect the digital economy, the National Cybersecurity Strategies, or NCSS.
Yeah, the NCSS is absolutely foundational. It defines a nation's specific goals, its objectives, its priorities, and that's critical for protecting their cyberspace and letting the digital economy really thrive. It sets the tone for investment in areas like R&D, awareness and training, and really importantly, international collaboration.
So if every nation agrees this strategy is essential, why is it apparently so difficult to develop a robust, globally consistent plan? What's the holdup?
Well, a central issue is the lack of a universally acceptable definition of cybersecurity. It sounds basic, but this conceptual confusion, it really permeates global deliberations. Definitions vary wildly, based on the nation's specific framework and who the stakeholders are. For instance, a comparative study looked at 10 nations and found Norway's approach is so broad it aims to protect, well, everything vulnerable. Sometimes they use terms like ICT security or digital security almost synonymously, even though they have quite distinct meanings and scopes. That ambiguity is really challenging when you're trying to align global defense efforts.
And when researchers compared the sort of ideal pillars of a strategy like investing in R&D, clear collaboration plans, against what nations are actually publishing, what were the most persistent weaknesses they found?
They found several pretty significant structural flaws, actually, across major global players. 6 out of the 10 nations they reviewed, and this includes the US, UK, Singapore, France, Australia, and Lithuania, they failed to explicitly state the methodology used in developing their strategy. Yeah, we're talking about national policy here, and they aren't detailing how they actually arrived at their conclusions.
That sounds like a fundamental failure of process, doesn't it?
Right.
And transparency, too, especially for policies affecting critical infrastructure. Did they at least detail how they plan to improve going forward?
Not really, not explicitly. 5 countries failed to give clear timeline for implementing key initiatives, and 6 didn't detail stakeholder involvement during the strategy's development. But I think the most striking finding regarding structural weakness was about learning from the past. None of the reviewed nations highlighted the failings of their previous strategies as a stepping stone for effective future development. They might mention past successes, sure, but that critical analysis of what went wrong seems to be missing. And that's essential for improving any strategic process, right?
Absolutely. That lack of accountability, that lack of transparency at the national level, well, it has profound implications for businesses who really rely on stable digital environments. Yeah. So let's shift our focus now from that high-level national policy down to actionable corporate steps. Let's turn to how individual supply chains build resilience. And we're going to use this sophisticated dynamic capabilities framework, sensing, seizing, and transforming.
Right. Supply chain, cyber resilience, or SCCR. It's basically the ability of these complex supply chains to successfully cope with digital disruptions. And this framework, it's essentially the organizational playbook. It breaks down the necessary capabilities into 3 dynamic micro-foundations: identification, immediate response, and then long-term adaptation.
Okay, so we're moving beyond just detecting a breach to constantly evolving how we handle threats. Now, before we dive deep into those 3 capabilities, let's take a quick moment to thank our sponsor. For those of you out there building these next-generation resilience strategies, the critical next step is finding the right tools. www.cisomarketplace.com is the essential destination for cybersecurity professionals seeking cutting-edge, vetted solutions. Basically, the tools to implement the very strategies we're discussing today. You can efficiently find what you need to build resilience at www.cisomarketplace.com.
Okay, so back to the framework. The first and micro foundation is sensing. You know the old adage, you can't protect what you don't understand. Sensing is all about scanning the environment to recognize current and emerging threats before they manifest internally.
And what are the practical capabilities under sensing for, say, a supply chain manager? What does that look like on the ground?
It really breaks down into three core actions. First, creating SC cyber risk knowledge. That means understanding where vulnerabilities actually lie within your whole ecosystem. Second, increasing SC visibility. So, monitoring the flow of information and goods across all your partner layers. And third, generating SC cyber threat intelligence. This often involves automated systems looking for patterns specific to your industry or sector.
Okay, makes sense. Then the second step is seizing. So you sense the threat. Now you need that immediate fast action, the short-term response.
Precisely. Seizing involves prioritizing short-term collaboration. This means having mechanisms already in place to share risk information with partners, like instantly. It also includes building SC flexibility, having agility and redundancy built into the system so you can maybe reroute supplies or services if one partner gets compromised. And crucially, pre-testing SC recovery plans. So when a disruption happens, the response is more like muscle memory, not a chaotic crisis meeting.
Right, rehearsed. And finally, transforming. This is the long-term structural alignment that ensures continuous resilience.
Yeah, this is the most strategic piece. Transformation requires aligning your resources to ensure a strategic fit with the evolving risks. It involves actions like SE reconfiguration, so actually changing the supply chain design or maybe switching partners to remove risk nodes. It means building a long-term zero trust culture internally and making sure all your resources, your technologies, your people are aligned. And finally, it often requires incorporating external expertise to maintain that structural alignment over time. It's a constant evolution, really, not a final destination.
That's a very practical playbook. Okay, moving from this theory of organizational resilience to the harsh reality, let's look at the financial impact of the threat landscape. The recent 2025 cost of a data breach report reveals some fascinating and pretty expensive insights.
Well, there was a minor positive global trend, interestingly. Average breach costs actually declined slightly for the first time in 5 years. They dropped just a bit to $4.44 million. And this is generally attributed to faster containment, likely aided by modern AI-powered defenses.
But the U.S. is clearly marching to the beat of a different drummer, isn't it? A much more expensive one.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. is a definite outlier. Average breach costs there have surged past $10 million. This anomaly seems to be driven by steeper regulatory penalties, higher litigation risk, and just the rising cost of detection in these complex, heavily regulated environments. And if we look at the costliest threats worldwide, the highest average costs actually come from malicious insider attacks. They're at $4.92 million.
Wow.
Followed almost identically by third-party vendor and supply chain compromise at $4.91 million.
Which just reinforces the criticality of that SCCR framework we were just discussing, right?
Exactly.
But the most frequent initial attack vector, it's still the oldest trick in the book, phishing. That accounts for 16% of breaches, costing an average of $4.8 million. It just highlights the persistence of human error, doesn't it?
It really does. And that leads us directly to the newest and maybe the most expensive culprit, the AI oversight gap. This is a critical risk management finding from the report. The research showed that shadow AI, so that's the unauthorized or ungoverned use of AI within an organization, it added a massive $670,000 to the average breach cost when those incidents occurred.
So companies are essentially paying this huge financial premium for innovation that they aren't even controlling properly. What does that governance failure actually look like?
It looks like total laxity, frankly. A genuinely concerning 97% of AI-related security breaches involved AI systems that completely lacked proper access controls. It seems the speed of AI adoption has just entirely outpaced the security team's ability to govern it effectively. And meanwhile, the attackers, they're also leveling up. 16% of breaches involved attackers utilizing AI themselves, often in the form of AI-generated phishing. That was 37% of those incidents, or deepfake attacks, which was 35%.
On the defense side, though, we are seeing some resilience in the response to ransomware. More organizations are refusing to pay the ransom, 63% in 2025, which is up from 59%.
That's true. However, the cost of a ransomware incident, it still remains high, especially when it results in disclosure by the attacker, averaging around $5.08 million. So refusing to pay doesn't make the problem disappear entirely.
Right, the cleanup cost is still significant. Now let's try and connect these digital threats back to the physical world. Let's focus on the critical infrastructure of global trade, ports, and maritime logistics.
Yeah, ports are such a linchpin of the global economy. They're the physical conduit for trade. Over 95% of U.S. cargo enters by ship, and that accounts for something like $5 trillion in annual economic activity. And we've seen just how fragile the system can be, whether it's disrupted by accident, like the Baltimore Key Bridge collapse, or by these digital shockwaves, like that widespread disruption caused by the July 2024 CrowdStrike software update.
And the threats they face are complex, aren't they? It's not just the external cyber attacks we typically read about.
Exactly. While ransomware is definitely a huge threat, think about the 2023 Lockbit 3.0 attack on the port of Nagoya that suspended loading and unloading for 2 days. Ports also deal with sophisticated advanced persistent threats, APTs, often state-backed espionage. And furthermore, there are these non-cyber risks that have a cyber element, like foreign actors using shell companies to gain unauthorized access to restricted physical or even digital port areas. It really blurs the line between traditional espionage and cyber risk.
And the sources seem to indicate a significant struggle for these ports to adequately fund their cyber defenses, despite their critical importance. Why is that specific sector having such trouble with investment?
Well, they often rely on temporary funds, like the FEMA Port Security Grants Program, which isn't ideal for long-term strategy. But the core issue seems to be that port actors really struggle with suboptimal cybersecurity funding levels because they have basically no ready way to calculate the return on investment ROI in security. If you can't accurately quantify the economic consequence of a potential disruption, cost of goods stalled, trade interrupted, it's nearly impossible to justify the large security expenditure needed to governing bodies or stakeholders.
That lack of foresight, that inability to quantify risk, it also impacts their ability to recover, right? Their continuity of operations, or a QO.
That's absolutely right. Their ability to revert to manual, non-digitized operations is, well, it's rapidly diminishing. The workforce with that historical manual know-how, they're nearing retirement. And unfortunately, that crucial knowledge often hasn't been properly recorded or transferred to the younger employees. So the option of just going manual in a crisis is effectively hitting a labor shortage, which removes a traditional resilience mechanism they might have relied on in the past.
Yeah, that's a worrying convergence of issues. For organizations, whether they're in maritime logistics or finance or any critical sector facing these kinds of risks, having instant access to vetted cybersecurity solutions is really non-negotiable. So we want to thank our sponsor one more time, www.cisomarketplace.com. It really is the resource for CISOs to find proven tools to tackle these complex, expensive, and critical security issues quickly and efficiently. Definitely check them out today. Okay, finally, let's look at the global regulatory response. It seems the geopolitical volatility we've been discussing is driving a pretty comprehensive compliance wave, both across the U.S. and Europe.
Oh, it's a massive shift. Mandatory disclosure requirements, structural security requirements, they're rapidly becoming global standards. Look at the EU Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA. It applies to hardware and software placed on the EU market, and it mandates that manufacturers provide a software bill of materials, SBOM, to market surveillance authorities.
So the SBOM, that formal list of all the components in a piece of software, it's quickly becoming a mandatory feature, not just a voluntary best practice anymore.
Exactly. It's already standard practice in the U.S. for specific areas like medical devices under the FDA and for DHS contractors. But the EU is making it a broad market requirement. And when we compare the EU and U.S. regulatory approaches, we see two different objectives, but they're both aimed at the same fundamental risk.
What are those differences in focus then?
Well, the EU's NIS2 directive, it focuses heavily on operational resilience. It's about harmonizing cyber resilience standards and mandating specific security controls for defined critical infrastructure sectors right across the continent. By contrast, the U.S. SEC Regulation SK focuses more on financial transparency. It requires public companies to disclose their cyber risk management and governance, specifically how it affects their financial performance. So they're approaching the risk from two different angles. One is an operational mandate, the other an investor protection mandate.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, our listener? We've mapped out a world where the battleground is increasingly digital, yes, but it's also tied irrevocably to physical infrastructure. And that necessitates integrated solutions across technology, process, and, importantly, people.
I think the core lesson here is that resilience, it's just not an optional extra anymore. It's a structural necessity. It has to be built into the DNA of the organization, not just bolted on afterwards. Whether you're a government agency writing a national strategy or a private company protecting your supply chain, you simply must integrate geopolitical foresight and detailed scenario planning into your strategic decision-making. The volatility that's been exposed by events like the war in Ukraine or the attacks in the Red Sea, well, that's now the operating assumption. It's not the exception anymore.
And a final provocative thought for you to explore, building on this theme of financial risk and geopolitics. The cost of a breach is high, we know that, but the sources are indicating insurers are starting to rewrite the war exclusion clauses in cyber insurance policies.
Yes, and this is potentially the largest risk shift of all. Historically, state-backed cyber attacks were often covered, or at least ambiguously covered. Now, insurers are looking to expand that exclusion to bar coverage for state-backed peacetime cyber attacks. So, attacks that occur outside of a formally declared war but still significantly impair national security or essential services.
Right. And since it's estimated that agents of foreign governments are responsible for roughly one-third of all cyber attacks globally, well, this creates a massive previously uninsured gap, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
What happens to corporate risk exposure if that huge chunk of devastating state-sponsored attacks is suddenly no longer covered by traditional cyber insurance? That's a question that needs some immediate answers in the boardroom, I think. Thanks again to our sponsor, www.cisomarketplace.com. Until next time, for the deep dive.